easy poos? Get your own.
It is the way of men to make monsters, and it is the nature of monsters to destroy their makers.
Amongst the slew of FPS titles over the years, F.E.A.R still stands head and shoulders above most. It has an incredibly satisfying combat system. It meshes beautifully with its enemy AI. This AI is still mostly unmatched nearly 17 years later as of writing. While not quite to the level of its combat, its horror approach is used to great effect to pace the game and build some excellent atmosphere. It's a style of shooter that I wish more would look to for inspiration, because it still stands mostly on its own in its approach. Big budget shooters have mostly gone the way of Call of Duty formula. The indies have mostly focused on the boomer shooter style. There are exceptions like the upcoming Trepeg 2, but F.E.A.R scratches a niche that most shooters simply don't focus on. If you're thinking about checking out F.E.A.R, and I highly recommend it, check out the PC Gaming Wiki page prior to running if you're playing on PC. There are some tweaks you'll need to make to get aspects like widescreen or large subtitles working. When it comes to FPS combat, there's a number of factors to consider that adds up to the whole experience. Every game will take the approach differently, some more than others. Some have different focuses. Some do certain aspects better than others. But when it comes to the overall package, the total sum of its moving parts, I can't think of many that do it better than F.E.A.R. These factors include the weapons, how it feels to play, the combat arenas, enemies, the enemy AI, and the aftermath. The last point being something most FPS games overlook entirely. One distinct feature of F.E.A.R is making use of slow motion. The team's goal was to make you feel like an action hero. With this, they greatly succeeded. There are fewer things more satisfying than taking an enemy's head clean off in slow motion. It doesn't just turn F.E.A.R into easy mode. The game is bounced around it, taking its superb AI into consideration. But before we talk about the AI, let's look at the weapons. At first, F.E.A.R has a pretty small weapon roster, although the expansion would bump these up. Two notable ones I want to discuss in the base game are the shotgun and the Type 7 particle weapon. If there is any gun I feel that an FPS must get right, it's gotta be the shotgun. I've always tended to get up close and personal. And F.E.A.R, well, it has one of the best shotguns around. It sounds great, it feels great, it has decent range. Taking heads off in slow motion as someone yells shit or something never gets old. The other standout is the Type 7 particle weapon. It has great range and can melt enemies down to their bones. Like the shotgun, it doesn't get old to clear out a combat area using it. One aspect about F.E.A.R that I love that most FPSs tend to outright ignore is the aftermath of combat. Most games, you just move on to the next bit. The way F.E.A.R is structured, it pushes you to admire your handiwork after a combat encounter. The bullets stop flying and things become eerily quiet as the music drops out. Most of these encounters are short bursts and then they're over. Quick note, I love the combat music in F.E.A.R. It works well with making you feel like an action star. In the aftermath, there's blood and bullets on the floor and walls, enemies stuck to the wall if you use the penetrator, heads rolling from well-placed shotgun blasts, skeletal remains with a particle gun. Dust that kicked up during combat fades out, something I wish more games made use of. There were numerous times where I wasn't sure I was hitting an enemy due to dust kicking up in the air as a result from gunshots or explosions. It's aspects like this that have made F.E.A.R such a standout title since its release in 2005. And speaking of standout, let's look into the enemy AI of F.E.A.R. Much has been discussed about the AI in F.E.A.R since its release, and for good reason. It's still mostly untouched with what it does here. I'm just going to give a Cold Notes version here. For more information, I'll link to some videos and papers to get more into the details of the AI system in F.E.A.R. The big distinction here is its focus on goal-oriented action planning. Most games will have a finite state machine where it tells the AI what to do in every situation. For F.E.A.R, it takes a planning approach. The AI is told what its plans and actions are, and it's up to the AI and how it wants to approach these goals. In this paper that they wrote about the AI, they give this nice example of Alma ordering pizza. Let's say that she's hungry. She could call Domino's and order pizza, but only if she had the phone number for Domino's. However, it's not her only option. She could bake a pie, but only she has a recipe. So her overall goal is to get to a state where she is not hungry. So she has these two options to satisfy this goal. So depending on the situation, she might only have one option, so she'll go that direction, or there are cases where she might have both, but the game would go in certain directions depending on how that was. That in a nutshell is the approach they took for AI, breaking down these goals into what they could do. Another aspect that's a bit of smoke and mirrors are enemies talking to one another. In a nutshell, it's just them vocalizing their decisions that the AI makes, but really adds so much to make it feel like the AI is really smart and know what they're doing. And that's why the game gets so much mileage out of these encounters with its basic replica clones. They'll come in packs, they'll flank you, they'll get the drop on you. Combat arenas are built around this AI approach. The game opens up in these sections, there's multiple pathways, an upper floor may be added, there are plenty of objects for cover. Of course, the game will mix up with other additions. Examples include the heavies, or these invisible ninja assassins that I found got underused throughout the game. And since its release, there hasn't been tons of development in regards to enemy AI throughout gaming. Granted, it's an incredibly difficult thing to pull off well, and not as marketing friendly compared to things like cool graphics or big explosions. But it does make a huge difference in why F.E.A.R has been so memorable. I mean, since then you've had titles like Alien Isolation that were well discussed for its AI, but again, it's a hard thing to cover and a hard thing to do well. So kudos to them for almost 20 years later having something that still works incredibly well and holds up beautifully. Now on the level design, a common complaint I see about F.E.A.R is the lack of the variety of levels. And it is a fair point, but they are designed in a way to get the AI running, and that was their main focus. As a result, things are a bit, well, industrial, as those are kind of the areas we'll be spending most of our time. These water treatment plants, corporate offices, hospitals, subway stations. It is a bit of a trade-off. I never found it a huge issue with what F.E.A.R sets out to do. What matters in the end is these combat encounters are extremely memorable. Every game needs downtime. FPSs all take a different approach to it. Some will do basic platforming or puzzles. While F.E.A.R does make use of it, the main focus on areas in between combat is, well, F.E.A.R itself. It takes a horror approach. It does a pretty good job with it, although it doesn't execute at the same level of combat sections. It does fall short of another Monolith title that came out around the same time frame, that being Condemned Criminal Origins, with its horror approach. To be fair, that does take a different approach to horror, and of course, horror is subjective. Condemned focuses more on the dread horror with its atmosphere, whereas F.E.A.R is more on the jump scare focus. Condemned was the whole way through, while F.E.A.R ebbs and flows with it. Not to say that F.E.A.R doesn't have dread or no atmosphere. It does deliver it in droves, but again, it doesn't quite hit the execution that it does with its approach to horror compared to its combat. That F.E.A.R is mainly derived from Alma, the poster child of F.E.A.R. Hey, it's the girl from the ring. That's what a younger Boulder Punch said when he first heard about this game. After all, the film came out just a couple years before F.E.A.R. Of course, this idea of the vengeful spirit has been around for well over 1,000 years in Japanese culture. It works for a reason. It's the hallucination sections that work really well building that dread and horror, before popping things back to normal, wondering what just happened. I always feel the use of ladder scares is something that creates so many opportunities in games to spook the player, especially in first person. In many cases, games don't take that opportunity in order to do so when the chance is right there. However, F.E.A.R does make use of it a few times.
He deserved to die.
What really gets me here is having Paxton at the bottom afterwards after having that one surprise. It's a really great 1-2 punch. Before we know it, we're back into the combat fold, and the game will do a dance of shifting between the two. It does a really great job with it. However, especially in the base game, their main focus was on the combat system, and for good reason. It would be the expansion packs, with emphasis on extraction point, that would have a much better execution of the horror elements of F.E.A.R. With that, let's look at some of the highs and lows of the base game of F.E.A.R and its two expansions. A man named Paxton has taken over an army of clones from the company Armacam as its psychic commander. So we need to go put him down. Simple enough. We are playing as the point man. It's mentioned that our reflexes are off the charts.
Him in the field? Are you crazy? He just transferred in a week ago. You've seen his training results. His reflexes are totally off the charts. I think he can handle himself.
Whatever, man. It's your call.
Goddamn right it is.
Don't worry. You'll be fine.
This little mention here is enough to acknowledge why we can make use of things like slow motion. Of course, more does come up later on. The first section prior to running into Paxton is pretty eerie. F.E.A.R does a great job of building tension here. And how does he stop us? Well, cutscene incompetence. I mean, hey, Monolith did the same thing with the antagonist getting the drop on us in Condemned Criminal Origins at the beginning. They could have done the classic hide him behind unbreakable glass or use hallucinations to get away. That would have done the trick instead of him hitting us with this board here.
It makes no difference. He deserved to die. They all deserve to die.
Early on, it looks like we'll be joined by others having allies during combat, but surprise, you're going to have to wait until the expansion pack for that. The game AI was built at this point to deal with just one opponent, that being us. It's here where replica forces enter the fold. From here we get into the rhythm of combat and horror downtime with Alma and Paxton. I do like how the game makes use of phone messages for exposition. You can let it play and wander about instead of reading emails, and it makes more sense than people leaving audio logs all over the place.
First message from
Chuck Haberger. It's Chuck Haberger. I've analyzed the readings and I'm recommended we suspend Perseus till we can figure out what's causing the synchronization.
I also like having radio play the news, hearing what they know versus what we know is going on. While the horror elements are well paced, and same with the combat encounters, I did find some stretches of the game would go on a bit too long before moving on to the next. Not this section of the game, that would be the Armacan headquarters. So even though some of the later sections of the offices here do drag, I do think overall it was my favorite section of the game. It's not the most exciting environment, it's just a plain, boring office. But the layout works well for how the game tackles combat, including the aftermath of the mess you leave. Imagine if Armacan had an office like some Silicon Valley startup. Would the replicas make use of the company slides? Would we have a horror section of Alma coming down the company slide? It's here where the assassins are brought into the fold. It is a nice addition to deal with them on and off throughout the game. If anything, F.E.A.R didn't make use of them enough. It's a nice blend of more horror into dealing with them. The way they could quickly get the drop on you, although a shotgun to the face will take care of it. They could startle you easily if you're not aware of your surroundings. They have a different kind of AI running here compared to the main replica forces we deal with. From what I understand, the AI doesn't coordinate amongst themselves unlike replica forces, it's just one-on-one here. Another reason I really enjoy the office section is Norton Mapes.
Don't shoot! My name is Norton Mapes. I'm an engineer.
Shit, it's a civilian. Give him a comlink.
Now, in a game full of action and horror, adding humor into the mix can be a bit tricky to do, but here the humor does land just right with Norton. It's not like Monolith doesn't have experience in it. Look to No One Lives Forever for an example. His read the fucking manual belt, his love of cheesy poos. He's the over-the-top stereotype of the asshole IT guy. I love it. He reminds me a lot of Wayne Knight's character in Jurassic Park. He's also not on the best of terms with some of his co-workers.
Norton, it's Ian Hives. Look, Alice Wade stopped by my office this morning, and I feel a little awkward saying this, but, well, I really need you to tone down the innuendo around her. It's not that I personally give a rat's ass, but the last thing we need right now is a sexual harassment case drawing unwanted attention to this task force. It's supposed to be a secret after all, okay? Thanks, Norton.
They did a really good job of making me hate this fucker for the hassle he causes us. And yet, when we find him near the end, shot and wounded, realizing his mistakes, I did feel bad for him. Wish I had some cheesy poos to give him for comfort here. And Norton Mapes is such a great name for this kind of character. Wait a minute, wasn't that long ago where I covered a game with an asshole character to deal with named Norton? That being Dead Space 3. There is a change up here with briefly dealing with ATC security. They're not as well coordinated as the replicas.
This way!
There is a turret section that's more of an annoyance than a change-up. That's dealing with turrets, although there's a little palette cleanser where we can take control of the turrets to reduce enemy clutter. So we get to Alice Wade to get her out of here, which felt like a good place to end the level, but just keeps going. She's not exactly a fan of flying. This section of heading down with the elevator and having it stop on multiple floors, it's a great idea, but the execution doesn't quite cut it. Although I did enjoy the elevator music. There are these drone enemies that we'll encounter as well, but we encounter so few throughout the game, I wish I should have just had the assassins instead here. Finally, we end up back to industrial districts for a change up in scenery, here being warehouses, abandoned houses. We're heading underground to get to the source of what is going on here with Armacam, with Paxton, with Elma. We finally put Paxton down. Use hallucination bits with the flying ghosts. I love the atmosphere, but it's clear they couldn't find a good way to have these encounters lead to satisfying gameplay. Although not having replicas now just stand there being out of commission now that Paxton's gone is pretty eerie. However, this leads to a pretty lame ending section where more ghosts just fly straight at us. Maybe they could have done something like have ghosts possess the replica bodies, so we could have some combat encounters with deranged replicas. At least the combat encounters have been much better. We also get revelations about Elma and ourselves. We are her son. What Harlan Wade and Armacam did to her are some truly disturbing things.
You will be a god among men. Take her back to the vault.
With that, we end off with a great cliffhanger, to be continued a year later with the release of Extraction Point.
What about Alma? What happened to her? What was that sound?
Extraction Point is a fantastic expansion pack. In many ways, it outdoes the base game. This was outsourced to Timegate Studios. Now, if that name sounds familiar, if it's just on the tip of your tongue, they were the unfortunate studio who had to deal with one Randy Pitchford, someone I view as the DSP of the game development world. Boo-hoo, like a big baby. They were hired to work on the clusterfuck that was Aliens Colonial Marines. Not soon afterwards, Timegate Studios would be shut down. Too bad they got caught into Randy's world, because they really show here how talented they are. Handing off an IP to another studio could have been a disaster. They missed the mark on what makes the game work, the tone, the pacing. There are a few stumbles here and there, but they mostly adhere to the F.E.A.R foundation and build off of it. The horror sections especially have received a noticeable improvement. However, these expansion packs aren't considered canon. Barkley's Shut Up and Jam Gaiden, this is not. Although seeing what Monolith did with F.E.A.R 2, well, that's a story we may look at another day. Extraction Point continues right after the ending of F.E.A.R. There are some additional weapons at our disposal, one being an FPS classic, the minigun. You can't go wrong with holding the trigger down and watching enemies fall or things exploding. That's another nice addition. How many things in our environment we could set off to explode. I love setting the canisters off the most to watch them fly in any which direction to cause some chaos. Another weapon we have at our disposal is the laser gun, which is plenty of fun. There's more variety in locations as well. Churches, hospitals, subways. Not the most exciting environments, but they work well with how F.E.A.R is designed. Paxton is back. Yeah, that doesn't make too much sense considering what happened in the base game of F.E.A.R.
I know it doesn't make sense. Not much does anymore. You killed me. I didn't like that.
Though I guess that's one way to address that and bring replicas back into the fold. While the horror here mostly lands, there's one moment that turns into hilarity. What the hell is with that music cue? It's an eerie moment as is, but this just made me chuckle. For an example, here's a moment from the next expansion pack. See, without the music, it still works well. Another addition we have are placeable turrets. They're nice to have, although I always seem to toss them wrong and they've not faced the way I wanted them to. We are reunited with Holiday, someone from the past title.
I'll live, but it'll be a while before I can ice skate again.
and he actually joins us for a time for some combat encounters. There's only a couple of these, and one of them were separated from him by a distance, because the AI has to act different here, so that's why we have these large combat arenas and one that separates us from him. Sadly, Holiday is not long for this world for very long. There's this great build up to these creatures, one of the game's best bits, expansion pack and base game.
Not good.
We end up at the subway station, which is a good setting, although it does drag on a bit too long. We also get this weird cutscene of Alma taking these guys down. Why did they do it like this? Couldn't we have watched this from behind glass or something? It just sticks out as a bit of a weird moment. We finally deal with these creepy invisible guys, although there's not much to them. They mostly make a straight line for us. And it is nice to see Norton briefly show up again.
How about the minigun? No?
However, extraction point saves the best for last, that being the hospital. This is my favorite level of the expansion pack in the entire game. Abandoned hospitals mostly in darkness? Yeah, that's not creepy at all. The hallucinations down the basement feel like it's a descent into hell. In a way, it reminds me a lot of Silent Hill. It's too bad the rest of the game's horror couldn't reach this level the entire time. And it's great to come back to reality, seeing what's around us, how much was a hallucination, and this change in music.
I just picked up a signal. If you can hear me, get to high ground. A chopper is standing by.
It is one of the most memorable moments in the entire F.E.A.R game, and a game full of memorable moments. It also ends with a fairly satisfying conclusion, a last wave encounter to deal with before we're picked up. But of course, the helicopter goes down. Geez, this game is worse than the Resident Evil series when it comes to downed helicopters.
We're in.
So a year later in 2007, Timegate Studios would follow up F.E.A.R with Perseus Mandate, which doesn't quite hit the same execution. There's a lot of signs of it being rushed and not as much care put into it. Uninspired feels like the best word to describe this expansion pack. Although it wasn't as bad as I was expecting it given its reputation, as this is the first time I've been playing it. As well, if I was waiting a year for another expansion, especially after Extraction Point, and this is what I got, I'd be quite disappointed too. We're not playing the point man here, but as a sergeant, who does have special powers. He could go slow motion as well. Is he another child of Alma? There are many more action set pieces here to its layout, and it starts pretty poorly. We do have combat with our allies, but the game's clearly not based around it. Although we do get separated pretty quickly from them. The combat encounters are still fine, it's just these settings are quite uninspired. And what's with these skyboxes? This looks like it was put together very quickly, clearly signs of being rushed. There are new enemies here, that being the Nightcrawlers. What's up with those super deep voices of them? Feels like it was pitched down.
Man down. He's coming.
They do have these advanced rifles, but that's it? That's all they really do? Wow, this is a pretty disappointing addition. There's a lightning gun, which is nice to have chain lightning, but it just feels like it lacks kick. It just feels very uninspired. Now, I usually love grenade launchers, and as quality as F.E.A.R can be with its weapons, a grenade launcher here isn't one of them. It'd always be a bit scattershot with what would happen as a result of me using them. There are a number of times where I do damage to myself. There's also these annoying Sam Fisher-like enemies that call me sweetheart.
Hello, sweetheart.
Boy, can these ones really tank some damage, and at this point I would just run past them. However, as we go underground and get to an old abandoned subway station, now this is more classic F.E.A.R. There's these scarecrow enemies, for better lack of a term of calling them, that I like the idea, and they're pretty easy to avoid. Oh, the Chen death scene here is great.
Somebody's got my leg. Somebody's got my leg!
This section is also pretty good because, well, it ends up being going through the subway station reverse from the previous expansion. There is a funny bit where we finally catch up with Morrison, who we've been chasing throughout, and when we finally meet up with him and he helps us, well, he meets his death pretty quickly.
Saw that.
He's dead.
Then we make our descent and things just keep going and going. We get more annoying fights with these Sam Fisher guys. Really, there's not a whole lot of great things to say here. It just kind of keeps dragging on and on. Although the horror elements are still quite good with its atmosphere. And there's not much that happens in the ending. We do see Chen as a ghost, which is kind of cool. I was expecting a little more, but that wasn't the case. But hey, there would be more in F.E.A.R 2, right? Well, this is where things get a little funny with canon and timelines. So someone sent me this infographic on Twitter, which was super helpful to get a condensed version down with the clusterfuck that happened over the IP of F.E.A.R. I'll link to it in the description. This isn't like Condemned where it's solely owned by Jace Hall. It's pretty complicated. As I mentioned, these two expansions are part of what is known as the Vivendi timeline. The base game is the Monolith timeline. These two expansions were published by Vivendi and developed by Timegate. And due to contract shenanigans, Vivendi would end up with the rights to the F.E.A.R name and branding. Warner Brothers and Monolith had the rights to the story and characters. Yeah, it's pretty weird. Vivendi was going to make their own F.E.A.R 2, hiring Day One Studios for the task. Monolith would make their own and pulled fans for a name, ending up with Project Origin. Vivendi would then merge with Activision to make Activision Blizzard in mid-2008. They would drop a number of the IPs under the Vivendi umbrella. And what ended up being some pretty good timing, Warner Brothers and Monolith would get the IP rights of the name and the brand back. This was also just a few months prior to the release of Project Origin, which would be renamed to F.E.A.R 2 Project Origin. And this would continue the Monolith timeline canon-wise. Day One Studios were hired to make F.E.A.R 2 under Vivendi, would be hired by Warner Brothers for F.E.A.R 3. So overall, it's a bit of a clusterfuck to follow. Monolith has had some bad luck with this. They're still unsure of who owns the IP rights for No One Lives Forever. And those two sequels are, well, they don't exactly live up to the first game, but those are videos for a later date. Overall, F.E.A.R still scratches a niche that few FPSs can. Its incredible enemy AI will always keep combat fresh. The weapons and combat arenas are incredibly satisfying. And while the downtime and horror sections don't always land, they do a great job of building atmosphere and giving F.E.A.R its distinct identity. F.E.A.R is also an interesting title where it marks the beginning of an end in a couple of areas. While not the last, it is a tail end of large budget releases on PC first. F.E.A.R was just released prior to the launch of Xbox 360. Not long afterwards, consoles would get their main focus, with PC ports mostly being afterthoughts. This would also be the tail end of expansion packs as downloading content became the preferred approach. Hearing the term expansion pack was usually a sign of quality. DLC, well, that could be all over the place. So if it's been a while for you, give F.E.A.R another go. It's one of those games that you can come back to over and over again. If you haven't done so already, hop to it. There are a few games that can hit that level of satisfaction that comes from taking enemies' head clean off with a shotgun in slow motion.
You just gonna stand here all day? Want some cheesy poos? Get your own.